Our guest today has been hosting dialogues with atheists, skeptics, and other non-Christians for about 2 decades. What has he learned from these interactions that can help us in our conversations? Is he more confident or less confident in his Christian faith? And how has the God conversation shifted in that time? Our guest today, of course, is the one and only Justin Brierley, who's here to talk about the release of his updated book, Why I Am Still a Christian. Justin, always good to have you on, my friend.
Oh, thank you for having me back, Sean. We go back a long way now, don't we? You must have come on several unbelievable shows over the years, and then we've ended up doing stuff in person. So always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation. Love the update to your book. And given how many conversations you've had, I'm always eager to see how you're thinking about stuff, how you kind of gauge where the conversation has gone. But one of the things you write in your book is this. You say, all these years on, I can honestly say I'm more confident in my Christian faith than when I began. So, two-part question. Why is that the case? And do you still have doubts? I guess three-part question. So why is that the case? Do you still have doubts? And what do you do when you have those questions 2 decades after having these dialogues?
That's right. Well, the short answer is the reason that I am more confident is because actually I discovered in the course of hosting innumerable debates and discussions with skeptics and atheists that actually Christianity could stand on its own 2 feet. It wasn't that there weren't questions and things that I haven't worked out yet, but I discovered that what you're essentially doing very often when looking at the rational case for Christianity is asking, does it make sense, and does it make better sense than the other options on offer? And what I discovered is that actually when you put it side by side with something like atheism or any other worldview, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity stands up really well. It's not that there are no questions and no mysteries, but actually it's more coherent overall than any other worldview I've been presented with. And so in a sense, at that level, it makes sense to me to put my faith in this, to say yes to Christianity. Do I have doubts? Of course, and that is just part and parcel of anybody, whatever your background, you should have doubts about something because we're not superhuman. We don't know everything. But I would say that the doubts I have are of the kind that are arguably sort of secondary. They're things I can live with, sort of being uncertain about. At the core of Christianity, the central claims it makes, I think you have an extraordinarily good historical record, philosophical witness, theological record, and it makes sense at a personal, emotional level as well. So for me, that's why, I do sense that despite the doubts that inevitably are part of life, Christianity kind of has always made sense over and against any other worldview. And I've forgotten the third thing. What was the
No,
third one you asked?
you answered it. And by the way, I agree. I don't know how anybody, regardless of what their worldview is, doesn't have some doubts today with the just information that's available. You've got to siphon yourself off from reality, and anyone who sees the world differently to not have some doubts for any worldview. So I agree with that. My take is very similar to yours. So I haven't been hosting dialogues in the way that you have. I've hosted some. I really am more confident that Christianity is true than 10 or 20 years ago. I was just talking with my wife about this, saying, God, the more I probe in, like you said, historically and theologically and philosophically and existentially, it really does make sense. And so you and I are pretty similar there. Now, the title of your book is Why I Am Still a Christian. Let me take a step back and just say, Justin, not why are you still a Christian? Why are you a Christian in the first place?
Well, I suppose there are different ways of answering that question. I mean, one answer I could give you is a kind of more of a historical answer about my life and the direction it took. The fact that I was raised in a Christian family, so that inevitably had an influence upon the things I was hearing, and of course my life took. And there was a point in my life as a sort of around the age of 15 when that all came together, and I had an experience of God that sort of made sense, and things came together where I, from that point on, didn't simply go to church because my parents took me. I went because I wanted to go. I really came to believe there was a God who loved me and who was interested in my prayers, and that when I read scripture and prayed,
Mm,
he could speak to me. So it kind of faith basically came alive. What happened next was that I encountered all kinds of hard questions about
mm,
Christianity because I, live in the UK. It's a very post-Christian country, and I went to a university, Oxford University, where there were lots of skeptics on hand to kind of try and, you know, ask difficult questions about your faith. So
mm,
I pretty soon discovered in my late teens and early 20s this thing that I later realized was called apologetics. People like C.S. Lewis offering kind of intellectual defenses of the Christian faith, helping me think through some of those big questions around suffering and
mm.
evidence for God, science and faith. And yeah, that's kind of what led me in the end to starting the Unbelievable show and to kind of hosting these kinds of dialogues and debates over nearly 20 years. Um, but the other way I would answer the question, why am I a Christian, is sort of is actually because, as I said earlier, it makes sense. And that's something that has become more and more apparent to me because of
Mm,
hosting these dialogues.
mm.
It wasn't, if you like, the thing that persuaded me to become a Christian initially. That was more of an experience. But the thing that has helped me to kind of have the confidence to present this as an intellectual option for people beyond my own personal experience, if you like, is the fact that when I look at the evidence, it makes sense. When I look at the evidence that's available to all of us, regardless of what our personal experience may or may not be, there's stuff that seems to point in the direction of God, and specifically in the direction of Jesus and the Christian faith. So for me, it was that combination of personal experience, but also putting the intellectual pieces together that is the kind of answer to why am I a Christian.
So you had an experience, and then apologetics became important to you. In my conversations and experience, that seems to be the case for more people than the opposite. Now, my dad is an exception to that, set out to disprove it. J. Warner Wallace is an exception to that. So I think it's false to just say apologetics is only for seekers or it's only for believers. But would you say that most people find it after they become a believer and have experience of God's grace or a need for God? Or would it be hard to just kind of quantify that difference to you?
I think inevitably a lot of people do discover it after they've had something or an upbringing in faith, and they're looking for ways in which they can help to make sense of that at an intellectual level. I just think that a lot of people's experience, or kind of what they receive often in church, sort of doesn't match kind of the level of, I suppose, teaching they get in all kinds of other walks of life, and they're made to feel like Christianity kind of is something I'm just supposed to treat in a different category altogether to the good teaching I have on maths or economy or history or whatever it might be. And what I've realized is actually no, you know, Christians need to be educated in their faith, in the reasons for their belief, just as much as anyone needs to be educated in anything. And it would be it's completely normal for Christians to go on this journey of experiencing something, but then needing to understand it more and go on that intellectual journey. So
Mm.
there's nothing wrong with that, and it's completely to be expected. I do bump into more and more people though for whom they've they've gone on that intellectual journey before arriving at
Mm.
the Christian conclusion, if you
Mm.
like, and so I think and that's obviously going to be the case for people like C.S. Lewis, who I mentioned earlier. He is a classic example of someone who was an atheist as a young man, but through really engaging the philosophical questions, conversations with his friends who were believers at Oxford University, he sort of arguably kind of reasoned himself into believing in God. He saw that this was a logical conclusion. Even with Lewis, though, there was eventually an emotional component to it, a personal component to it, where he kind of found that he needed to make sense of this kind of somewhat abstract belief in God by actually meeting the real person of Jesus Christ. And so it's always going to be, at some point you're going to find that those two worlds collide, this kind of
Mm.
intellectual journey and the heart experience. Sometimes one comes before the other, or the other comes before the other, but in the end, at some point those two things have to meet.
The key is not to universalize it. I think if we have an experience and then
Mm.
apologetics comes afterwards, I see people saying, look, this is only after you believe. Don't reason people into faith. And then people who
Yeah.
follow the evidence are like, every single evangelistic encounter needs to have apologetics. I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
think we have to universalize here.
No,
So,
no,
by the way, those
no.
of you watching, chances are, if you're watching this, you follow Justin's kind of ministry or mine. Let us know if you follow apologetics, if you're a believer. Was it
Mm.
before you came to faith? Was it after? I will read these comments. I would love to know in your experience. If you're an atheist, just tell us, or not a believer, why you're watching this and why apologetics interests you. I'd love to know your thoughts. Now, Justin, one thing I've been doing recently is I've been asking over 100 Christian apologists what they consider the best argument for the existence of God. And I mean just like morality, fine-tuning, consciousness, whatever. Now, if you had to pick one, what do you think is the best argument for the existence of God, and why?
So my favorite argument for the existence of God, the one that I find most intellectually compelling, is the moral argument for God.
Mm,
And and that's, again, funnily, I've already mentioned C.S. Lewis a couple of times now, but interestingly, arguably, that was the argument that led him to theism, to belief in God. There was another kind of separate journey that had to happen for him to become a full-blooded Christian. But I think the reason that the moral argument is so compelling to me is because it's not just a sort of logical deductive argument. I mean, it is at one level that it's this argument that for objective values and duties to exist in the world, there has to be a sort of transcendent moral lawgiver that to make sense of that idea, and it doesn't work on a kind of atheistic worldview. But the reason that it's a powerful argument for me is because it's not, it kind of hits differently than other sort of arguments
mm,
like maybe the fine tuning of the universe or a philosophical evidence for God, because it matters. It matters what we think about right and wrong. Most people, this isn't just a sort of intellectual game.
that's right.
They're invested in whether we act justly, what is right and wrong in the world, how we treat other people. And so at that level, I think the argument becomes most powerful when people are actually confronted with real evil or blinding goodness, because it's sometimes difficult, I think, for an atheist to make sense of those categories once they're actually presented with a real example, a stop you in your tracks example of someone doing genuine evil. If you go to the Holocaust Museum or something like that, I think it's much harder to come out of that and just say, well, the universe just runs according to a blind process whereby, survival of the fittest, and whatever plays out, plays out. I think it's much harder for you to come out of something like that and sustain a purely atheistic account of morality. So that's why I think it hits you in a different way. And for me, yeah, I guess it's because of that existential aspect of the argument that I
Mm,
find it very powerful. And I rarely find atheists who want to just roll over and say, hey, morality is just whatever the happenstance, the zeitgeist is of any given time or place. Because as soon as they say that, then you say, okay, so slavery was fine when it was being practiced. Rape was fine when that was the way that senior Roman males treated, their underlings. And they're like, oh, well, no, I'm not saying it was fine. Suddenly, when you give them a concrete example, the whole kind of morality is just whatever, comes out in the social zeitgeist doesn't feel so compelling anymore.
mm.
Um, and I just think there's something powerful about because morality impresses itself upon you.
That was a great answer, and one of the most common ones that I'm getting, Justin. I've heard from William Lane Craig and John Lennox and Os Guinness and Paul Copan, Nancy Pearcey, and I'm going to make a short video on this. Some of the answers are completely expected. Others totally surprised me. But morality is definitely one of the most common ones because there's the intellectual case, but it's
Mm,
existential, like you described.
mm, mm.
So I'm with you. Now, I want to know, you've probably hosted hundreds of people in conversations. I'm really curious at a conversation that's gotten the right kind of feedback. And I don't just mean numbers. Sometimes numbers aren't necessarily, or views, the feedback we want. But maybe just take us, you've had so many guests, someone you felt like, you know what, they handle themselves well, they advance the conversation. And you could name this person or not, but I'm really looking for just some insights of people who you think do spiritual conversations well and what they do that we could learn from.
Well, you just named the person that immediately sprang to mind, and that's John Lennox, who is
Mm,
just a wonderful human
mm,
being and also a wonderful thinker
mm,
and Christian apologist. John and I, have known each other for a number of years now. And for those who aren't familiar with his ministry, he's an Oxford Don. He's a professor of mathematics and the philosophy of science at Oxford University. And he had, a really impressive academic career, even really before he started to really become a well-known Christian thinker, writing books, engaging Richard Dawkins, the New Atheist, and that kind of thing. But I think the reason why I just love having a John Lennox say in a conversation is because not only does he bring that intellectual side, but he also just brings the ability to have a really down-to-earth human kind of
mm,
conversation with
mm,
people. He's got that winsome kind of side to him where he really takes the care and the time to understand someone, to listen to them, to engage them where they are, to be friendly, and it makes a huge difference to some kinds of arguments. Well, some kinds of conversations that could have been arguments but turned into really good quality conversations because John, just showed people respect, was engaged, interested. He wasn't just there to sort of ram home his point. He really was there to engage and understand and so on. And I just think he's a great model of respectful conversation and dialogue. I mean, that's not to say, he's been in. I've put him in one or two conversations where I was putting him up against very kind of quite dogmatic, set in their ways, new atheist types.
yeah.
He's done a couple that I moderated with Peter Atkins, who's
Mm.
almost at the extreme end of the kind of curmudgeonly atheist kind of character. I think he almost plays up to it, really, where he just won't accept any kind of evidence and he just dismisses everything as poppycock and delusional and everything else. And bless him, John Lennox is incredibly gracious and patient, and but there's those kinds of conversations sometimes. A similar one I
Mm.
remember where I put John Lennox in conversation with Lawrence Krauss, and it may have been slightly to do with the fact Krauss was on a line at midnight from a hotel somewhere, but Krauss was kind of cranky and dismissive, but John again just very patient and gentle, but also assertive, not letting Krauss get away with too much. But then other conversations, where John's really come into his own have been where you've got someone who is a genuine seeker and someone who's perhaps in a mode where they're starting to question their own atheism. And again, John was just so respectful, but pushing in all the right ways. When
Mm.
I sat him down for a kind of public conversation, you might remember this, Sean, it was in Costa Mesa with Dave Rubin, the
Mm.
YouTube talk show host. And Dave Rubin had been on an interesting journey at that point in his life where he had kind of gone from this very new atheist kind of way of seeing the world to increasingly being influenced by people like Jordan Peterson and others to sort of ask whether actually there might be some value in faith uh, and so on. And John just had a really delightful conversation with him on stage where he just listened, answered some of his questions, pushed in, kind of gently challenged him to consider Christ, and also sort of drawing upon Dave Rubin's own sort of Jewish heritage along the way, and saying some really helpful things. And again, it was the audience just leaned in for that conversation. It was
Mm.
one of the best conversations I've ever hosted because it felt like there was something really important was happening on the stage. And so he's kind of one of my heroes when it comes to these kinds of dialogues.
Lennox is someone I look to as well for a lot of reasons. Now, I can imagine someone right now going, okay, Justin, he's a professor at Oxford. He has what, 3 PhDs? He's brilliant. I could never do that. And honestly, I look at stuff he does, and I'm happy to say I could never do that. I'm not going to get a third PhD and teach at Oxford. He's smarter than I am. Like, that is completely true. What would you say to other, just maybe more normal folks without that level of expertise and education, who are trying to have these conversations? What can they do to do it more successfully?
Well, the first thing I'd say is you don't have to have the PhD to have the kind of conversations that John Lennox is having. It's obviously helpful to get yourself aware of the dynamics and the shape of these conversations and arguments, so that you're prepared to have a conversation. But the vast majority of people you and I engage with, Sean, are not sort of PhD level Oxford graduates. They're people
Sure.
who have the kinds of questions that most people have about life and faith and God. And so, yeah, it's important that we don't set this up as some kind of, you have to have this big shot education to be able to engage people. There are certain situations where that's helpful, where, but they're not the everyday situations,
Mm.
and so we should be looking for the expert in biblical studies or hermeneutics or whatever when we are engaging a bar M. And I'm not you don't want to just put a layperson opposite someone who's in that position. But for most conversations, honestly, we're just asked, we're just doing what we're asked to do in scripture, which is to be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks us about the reason for the hope that we have, but do it with gentleness and respect. um, and I know that's an obvious answer, but it does bear repeating, because the way you say things is just as important as the things you say. And it, you, you know, all the training in the world in apologetics doesn't go far if it's not delivered with the kind of compassion that we're asked to do so
Mm.
in that verse, that gentleness and respect. Um, I've been in so many conversations where just what should have been a great argument never landed because of the way it was delivered.
Mm.
And so many conversations where a pretty poor argument landed way better than it should have because the person was just kind, and
uh,
that gave that skeptic the opportunity to come back, and they wanted to come back for another conversation,
mm.
and that kind of thing. So I just think we shouldn't underestimate that it's just about nurturing a sense of common decency, a conversational approach, a curious approach to people around us, not constantly having to be able to demolish their arguments and answer back. Being willing to say, I don't know, um, let me look into that and get back to you. Could we continue the conversation? That is a great answer sometimes, and
Mm.
sometimes a more fruitful answer, actually, because it shows someone that you're genuinely interested. You want to have a genuine conversation with them. You're not trying to, kind of just win a kind of intellectual game. So I think that's those are some of the lessons you could draw out from that winsome approach of a John Lennox.
I appreciate that you said saying I don't know is not only a permissible answer, but sometimes the best answer because it keeps the conversation going. And you also talked about curiosity. That's something I try to have motivate my
Mm.
channel. I think of like charity, civility, curiosity are some of the principles that I hope are driving some of the conversations that I have. What would you consider? And you don't necessarily have to answer them right now because you have shows in this, I have shows in this. What do you think are the hardest questions for Christians to answer?
I mean, almost certainly the questions where, again, it touches on a real existential issue, a nerve for the person that you're having the conversation with. Because you can have an abstract conversation about sexuality and ethics, but when you're having it with someone for whom that is foundational to who they are and their life, it's a different kind of conversation, inevitably. And so they tend to be the hardest conversations, because you're not just approaching this, ideally at least, you're not just approaching this as a purely kind of uh, rational conversation, where we're just going to get the facts on the table and debate it. You know, to me at least, I would in that situation be in the position where I want to treat this person respectfully. I don't want to kind of come across as harsh or dismissive of their view, because this matters so much to them. That doesn't mean I'm not going to, try to represent and be biblically faithful as far as I can.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I'm going to be really thinking really carefully about the way I'm addressing them, that I'm not creating unnecessary pitfalls or trip hazards along the way. And so I think those are the hardest conversations when it really matters to the individual
Hmm.
in question, and that could be on all kinds of things. Equally, if I could have answered, well, suffering is the hardest question, because in a sense it is just a hard question to answer. But in another sense, I've got my stock set of kind of responses to the question of suffering. I could pull them out, they're there in my back pocket. But the reality is, if it's someone whose loved one, whose child has just died, it's gonna sound kind of cold and harsh, a lot of that stuff, if I'm just sort of reaching for a sort of logical theodicy at that point. And so that's going to be a much harder kind of conversation, because you're actually, what you're probably really needing to do is give some kind of pastoral hope to that person, more than just an intellectual answer. So it's whenever the personal is involved that it's the hardest conversation, but they're also the most important conversations usually. So they're worth taking the time to really do well.
That's an important distinction, to not be issue driven, but person driven. Whenever I give a lecture and take questions from Christian or non Christian audiences, the majority of questions have some personal element behind it. They're not just abstract. There's a reason this person is asking that question that's often personal, that hopefully shapes and influences the way I respond to them. Now, I've been saying something lately, and I'm curious if you agree with me. I've said, almost a direct quote, that most people are open to spiritual conversations. Someone pressed me for my data recently, and I said, I don't have a study on this. I don't know how you'd really prove it, because no one's going to say in a study, no, I'm not open to spiritual conversation. Like, everyone's going to say that they are. But from watching your conversations, from having my own, from family, from friends, I mean, it's the exception in my case for somebody who doesn't want to have a conversation, at least at the right time, in the right way, in the right place. Do you think most people are open to authentic spiritual conversations? And what would you base that in, if you agree? Or if you disagree, why do you disagree?
I agree, but I'd say that, the tide has shifted in that direction quite recently. And I say that because if you go back 20 or so years to when I launched The Unbelievable Show in the mid 2000s, in the heyday of the new atheism, um, there wasn't as much of an appetite, I think, for those spiritual conversations. There might be been something of an appetite for kind of big set piece debates, on intellectual questions, but sort of it was almost considered embarrassing to sort of talk, to sort of have a genuinely spiritual conversation about the big questions and that sort of thing. And generally in the UK, very post-Christian culture, very secular, it wasn't the done thing. I do feel, though, 20 years on, that things have shifted a lot, and the types of conversations people are willing to have changed a lot. I lay out a lot of this in the book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, the way in which I sensed that, because the new atheist moment and that very secular atmosphere has waned significantly for all kinds of reasons, it feels like it's opened up the ground, it's softened the ground for people to ask those questions again. They don't feel embarrassed talking about God in public any longer, because lots of people are doing it. Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, the historian, and all those people who, I've talked about in my book and podcast series. But now you've got Joe Rogan, inviting on Wes Huff and having all kinds of interesting conversations with people you wouldn't have seen him having those conversations with 5-10 years ago. So, and it's when those kind of gatekeepers, if you like, start to model it, suddenly everyone, I think, kind of follows suit. It kind of gives permission for people to think, okay, yeah, I can talk about this, because it turns out it's not cringe or embarrassing or whatever. And I think you're especially seeing that among the youngest generation. And this is where I do think we are seeing hard data come through now about the openness. Gen Z have been labeled the open generation, and they are just way more open to spirituality, spiritual conversations than their parents or grandparents. Some recent data here in the UK showing that Gen Z are half as likely to be atheists as their parents and grandparents. And now that can be kind of a wide openness to lots of types of spirituality, from crystals to manifesting to witch talk. There's a lot of stuff that's out there, but interestingly, Christianity is also on the table. They're not dismissing it in the way their parents and grandparents did. And I've kind of got a theory for this, that basically, because certainly here in the UK, there was still a kind of cultural Christianity that pervaded the
Mm.
atmosphere for a long time in the era of the boomers and the Gen Xers and even the millennials to some extent. It kind of gave people permission to kind of assume that they knew what Christianity was and reject it. They were sort of had just enough to be inoculated against it, if you like. Um, Whereas Gen Z have not been to church. They don't know the first thing about Christianity. They're genuinely unchurched. But in a funny way, that sometimes can be an advantage because they've got nothing to kick against and to reject, um, because they didn't grow up with it around them. And so there's a genuine openness, there's a genuine curiosity when they meet a Christian who says, whose life looks kind of different to theirs, and they seem to have a certain joy or peace about them. And suddenly there's a kind of, they're not immediately put off at the idea of church. So I was amazed to hear from, for instance, a student, a Christian student organization last year that I interviewed, talking about just the huge upturn in the number of young people um, interested in conversations about Christianity, open to accepting invitations to church. They conducted a poll across all of the universities in the UK, and they were staggered to find that 75% of non-Christian students said that if they were asked to church, they would go. They'd
Mm.
never seen a result like that
Mm.
before. And this person was telling me that we're just seeing something really different in the last few years. There's just this kind of new openness. Um, Likewise, I've seen other similar statistics around this kind of openness. And some of it, yeah, is translating, I think, into people having those conversations, being far more open to it, and even going to church. Lots of, at this point, still anecdotal, but kind of starting to be backed up by hard evidence of a lot of young people, especially young men, interestingly, walking into church, often with absolutely no Christian background whatsoever, but they're just interested. They've heard something, they've listened to a podcast, they've bought a Bible, they're willing to give it a try. And so I'm very excited, Sean, that this openness seems to be suddenly manifesting among that generation.
I haven't heard you float the theory quite like you did, but I've actually made somewhat of a similar point that the new atheist movement only makes sense if there's something to fight against, that there's an
Mm,
awareness of Christianity and there's a resonance in culture that at least the critiques can land and be understood. It's like we have a new generation of thinkers like Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland and Jonathan Rauch kind of rediscovering, in a sense, some of these Christian stories. And I loved in We Who Wrestle with God, uh, Jordan Peterson, he's like, I recognize there's difficult Old Testament passages, but let's not stop there, as, of course, the New Atheist did. Let's go deeper and understand the story on its own terms. And what would it be about a God that would be in favor of just reacting so strongly to sin? Like, it's the right questions are being asked,
mm,
getting beyond these surface critiques to get to the heart of what maybe Jesus taught and the Bible is about, and then asking questions whether or not we need it for civilization in our age. So I agree with you. I think I give you huge
mm,
credit
mm.
for your book, The Surprising Rebirth
Well,
of Belief in God, for kind of seeing that trend ahead of time, picking up on it, and charting where that conversation was going.
yeah, and obviously a lot of this stuff has crystallized sort of since the publication of the book, and kind of being able to track this surprising rebirth to some extent in real time through doing a podcast documentary series that picks up on a lot of these questions and some of this new stuff that's emerging in terms of what I've called the meaning crisis and the spiritual hunger that
Mm.
seems to be there among Gen Z. And one of the really simple things I kind of realized in interviewing some of these young people is, whereas for you and I, the new atheism is something that kind of is a present reality because we just lived through it, right? For those people, it's a history thing. It's like oh
Mm.
yeah, I was still in nappies when that was happening. So it's kind of, it's literally it completely passed them by because they weren't even born at the time. So there's a kind of it just made me reappreciate the way things do change quite quickly, and the kind of spiritual atmosphere can actually, it turns out, change quite quickly. And I don't know exactly what that means, but I do feel like there's this opportunity. And what I'm excited about is that kind of you and I have been plugging away for decades now, and your dad was the OG, of apologetics, kind of doing our thing, kind of trying to get people to take the case for Christianity seriously, sometimes having some good fruit, sometimes feeling like it was, really barren, dry earth that we were trying to harvest from. But then something happens. It's like something shifts in the culture, and suddenly all that hard work starts to bear fruit. And you suddenly get Wes Huff on Joe Rogan, the most listened to podcast, saying all the stuff that you and I have been talking about for years. But suddenly it's like people are ready to listen. And it's like, oh, wow, there's a kind of a hunger now for this. And it feels like we're kind of entering a different way in which this stuff is going to land with people compared to, I don't know if that makes sense to you,
Hmm.
Sean.
It totally does. I agree that there's a meaning crisis and an openness and an interest that there maybe wasn't in the past. Here's a few other ways I see kind of the God conversation shifting, and I'm curious your take on this. And you can comment on any or all of these or none of them. One way is the conversation. You've mentioned Wes Huff a couple times. He got nitpicked from critics on every single thing that he said. And some objections were fair, of course. Let's nuance what we mean by the Dead
Mm,
Sea Scrolls and word for word. Like, these are fair. But it's also like we've hit a point where there's now full-time counter apologists responding to even the slightest stuff that is said, which on one hand is like, okay, good. If we say we care about truth, we need to be more careful than ever. I've gotten some pushback and I'm like, that's nitpicking ridiculous. Other times I'm like, you know what? I think you're right about that. I need to shift
mm,
course and adjust. So I see that shift. Another shift that I would argue is that we spend a lot of time talking about naturalism and materialism. And understandably, it has a huge influence in academia and
mm.
you see it in other realms of influence. But, the atheist public is maybe 4% roughly. Maybe you add
Mm,
agnostics,
mm.
it's into the lower teens. But those who
Yeah.
practice tarot cards and believe in reincarnation, like New Age beliefs, are way bigger and more
Yeah.
entrenched than atheist beliefs are. I was just watching Cobra Kai with my 12-year-old son. He's like, Dad, what are tarot cards? Because it was kind of woven in there. I'm like, okay, let's have a
Mm,
conversation
mm,
about this.
mm.
So I see that shift taking place.
Yeah.
Agree or disagree on those 2 points? There's more that I see, but what do you think about those two? How does that strike you?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think there is a huge shift, lots of shifts taking place. And I think the new atheist thing was a bit of a diversion because uh, it was kind of trying to demolish Christianity per se, but it didn't really replace it with anything. All it did was open up a void where all of these things then flooded in. And so you know people, I think what the new atheists have discovered is people are intrinsically religious. Actually, very few of them end up
Mm-hmm.
becoming card carrying scientific materialists. They will, once you've kind of got rid of God, you're going to replace it with something quasi religious. And that's going to be very often either some esoteric new age spirituality, or it's going to be a God like on the progressive left, some sort of sexuality or gender thing that becomes your God. It could be a political mythology on the right that becomes your God.
Mm-hmm.
We're great at manufacturing idols to put in the place of God, basically. And new atheism had this very sort of naive idea that once we get rid of Christianity, we'll just go forward into this scientific utopia. And of course, that didn't emerge. And so I think you're absolutely right that this is the landscape that we're dealing with now. I think in a very ironic way, at least the thing that the new atheists and Christians broadly did have some common consensus on was the idea of objective truth, and the fairly
That's right.
modernist idea that there is a truth to be debated. And now that that's so under attack, even in biology and lots of other areas, it's funny that a lot of, I talk about this in the book. There is a lot of unexpected bedfellows now who kind of have a common cause, both Christians and atheists, who maybe are pushing back against some of that stuff. So I was at, just recently, the ARC conference in London, and this is a sort of about 4,000 people all under one roof. A lot of them are Christians, but a lot of them are secular, atheist, agnostic people. But their kind of common concern in kind of the need to rebuild Western civilization has kind of brought them together for a common purpose. And it's just fascinating to see the way that the ground is shifting and changing. All I'm saying in all of this is to say that it, 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 what we're really, as you say, facing now is a kind of a what worldview is going to make sense. Is it going to be a sort of some kind of new age sort of thing? Uh, I think the thing I'm glad about is that a lot of young people, especially who are engaged in these different things, you don't have to kind of try to convince them that God exists or that there's genuine evil. They're sort of there. They know that that stuff exists, and they may even have come across it when they were messing around with a Ouija board or something like that. I think now, I think that the opportunity it presents Christians is to say, you're looking, like Paul said to the Athenians, you're searching for God, but you're kind of looking in all the wrong places. Let me tell you about the person you've actually been looking for. And I'm quite excited at that opportunity, because it feels like I say, this spiritual hunger that's manifesting in all these different ways. We know that there's an answer to that. We know that there's a person we can point them to who will make sense of that search. And I just wonder, as they continue to be let down by, whatever the ideologies are that they're chasing after, or the spiritualities they're chasing after, as those just simply don't satisfy, I feel people kind of get to a point of desperation where they're ready to listen again to the Christian story and to Jesus.
So when I look back on the new atheist movement, 10, 12 years, in some ways, I think it made Christian and Christian apologists stronger, because these guys came out with their guns blazing and attacked the scriptures, attacked the goodness of the faith. And it was like we had a cause to rally and respond to. And I think looking back, apologists have upped their game and learned a lot because of it. That's a positive. On the negative side, I've been thinking about, even in my own life, thinking, have I thought about atheists through the lens of the new atheists? The atheists are all these aggressive, want to destroy you, kind of Dawkins and Daniel Dennett approach. And yet, as I speak to a number of atheists, they're like, they don't speak for me. They represent a small segment of atheists, and maybe poison the well in terms of the kinds of conversations that you and I want to have. So do you look at them like I do, as a mixture of positive and negative, and maybe concerned that there's still a vestige among some Christians of like, we're fighting the new atheists, when everybody's going, you know what? The conversation shifted. We just want to sit down and
Yeah.
have a dialogue.
Yeah.
Do you share that
I,
concern?
I do. I do. I think sometimes we end up answering yesterday's questions when the conversation has moved on, as you say. And there was an important place for that kind of approach to the new atheists when they were sort of the big culture makers of the mid 2000s. But as you say, I think that movement has waned. A lot of the people who were perhaps invested in that quickly grew tired of it, and weren't so keen to be associated with it. They didn't speak for all atheists, of course. And what I found is that even those who were part of that movement, a lot of them have changed their tune. Again,
Mm.
I was at this ARC conference, and I spoke to two or three people who basically all said the same thing to me. These were atheist agnostics who all said, yeah, I was very much on board the Richard Dawkins thing. I was cheering them on in the mid 2000s, 2010s, but I've completely changed my mind now. I think the Bible is probably the deepest, most profound book we've got. It has absolutely shaped our culture. I'm all for church and Christianity. I'm not quite sure I believe it yet, but I'm going to church. I'm sort of trying it out. And that is just a million miles from the conversations I would have been having with these people 15 or 20 years ago.
Mm.
So it's interesting. Even the new atheists themselves have grown up, and they're kind of reconsidering things. And not all of them have kind of made it across the line to Christianity, but this is this really different openness I'm encountering among a lot of them.
Yesterday, I was having a conversation in a class. I have an undergrad class at Biola, and it's about 25 juniors and seniors. It's called Gospel Kingdom Culture. So it's hot ethical issues, apologetic issues, and spiritual conversations. I was asking my students, I said, how well do you think most Christians do in just having a dialogue with others in an authentic, civil fashion who see the world differently? And I think my students do this amazingly, but let's just say they were very less than optimistic that most churches and Christians do this well. I'm going to somewhat put you on the spot, but if I said, all right, Justin, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 the lowest, 10 the best, if you were just from your experience, how would you rate Christians as a whole being willing to just lean in and meaningfully engage those who see the world differently with curiosity, non-defensively? How would you rate the church as a whole, if such things even possible?
I would say, I don't know, maybe a 3 or a 4, but
Mm,
rising. I think it's getting
okay.
better. And it does depend a bit on the context as
Sure.
well. I think churches that have kind of been in a kind of very secular environment for a while are just a little bit more attuned to how to have the better conversations. I think it's the churches that have kind of been able to live to some extent in a Christian bubble. You know, I'm thinking maybe parts of the Bible Belt and that kind of thing, where it's a bit more of a culture shock to kind of navigate helpful conversations because yeah, you haven't had to think outside of the parameters so much of your own sort of Christian culture. I think the reason Unbelievable kind of worked very well, you know, worked as a kind of UK show, but that was listened to all over the world, including, you know, a lot of people in America, was because we were coming from that very secular culture. We were used to that being the environment into which we were speaking. And so a lot of Christians had just grown up, me included, sort of having to navigate those kinds of conversations, knowing that, you know, this is going to be uncomfortable, but we're going to do our best, and we have to try and make the best of this situation we find ourselves in. There was no assumption that Christianity was the kind of the de facto assumption or anything in the culture anymore, and I think that helped because actually, you know, I remember when I bumped into John Mark Comer some years later, you know, who'd been doing ministry out on the West Coast in Portland. And he said, you know, in terms of American cities, we are the most secular city in
Mm,
America. And he said, the reason I find so many people listening to the Unbelievable show here is because you get it. Uh, so I think, you know, Unbelievable turned out to be very popular on those kind of more coastal cities which were much more on the edge, the leading edge of the kind of secular thing in America, less popular arguably in the Bible Belt because they weren't having to have so many of those conversations. So I just think I sort of forgot what you asked me originally, but the point is it's yeah, there's some churches are getting better, but they're kind of being
mm,
forced to get better at having these conversations because of the encroaching secular culture. And and I think it's again one of the benefits of the new atheism was forcing Christians to think better, to dialogue better. I do see it as a kind of a bit of a God-given gift, actually, Richard Dawkins and everything, because it did force us to step up our game apologetically. The Unbelievable show, I'm sure, wouldn't have existed without the new atheism. But at the same time, it so all the things that have kind of we often think were terrible for Christianity, you know, atheism, secularism, so on, they've actually helped to improve our game, actually, at answering. And
mm.
I think there are just a number of churches that are still, perhaps still like, trying to catch up with that because they've just been a little bit behind that kind of that wide secular culture that so many of us are now completely used to. And
I think that contextualization makes a lot of sense. There's a big difference, you're right, in Portland versus maybe in rural America and Central America, where people have not faced some of those challenges as existentially and directly, but we're seeing that change as well. I'm curious, Justin, where does your just willingness and desire to have these kind of civil conversations come from? Is it your wiring? Is it an experience that you had? Is it just kind of assessing culture and figuring out what is needed at this moment? Is it being British? Is it a combination of all these things? Because people ask me that question often, say, you and Justin have a similar way of dialoguing with people, and I have my answer to it. But I'd love to know where that comes from for you.
Mm. And just for the record, I couldn't say it when you asked me, but who are my favorite Christian apologists? If I hadn't been talking to you, I would have mentioned you because
Oh my goodness.
I've always rated you. I know I'm making you blush now, but the the point is, I think the reason I invited you on back onto the Unbelievable show so often because you were absolutely brilliant. We did think very the same lines
Mm,
about what makes conversation, the intellectual side of it, and and yeah, I guess that comes out of the same place for both of us, I imagine, which is we really want people to come to know and love Jesus, but we don't see people just as necessarily, a project to be argued into something, but as a person hopefully to be loved. And so the best kinds of dialogues are the kinds which are, yes, are intellectually stretching, but are also kind of loving. You take that person seriously. You don't dismiss them. You don't just treat them as a project or whatever. And and that's the thing I've loved, you know, in a way, one of the things I didn't anticipate when I launched, a dialogue show like I believe was just how many relationships it would end up in, how many friendships I
mm.
would have with people across the aisle, and the way in which that actually, in all kinds of interesting ways, makes a big difference. It really is. It turns it, as I say, from being this moving intellectual counters around to something that's really real, because you get to know people and you get to know the things that are
Mm.
sometimes behind the intellectual questions, and you kind of go on a journey. I had the privilege of going on a journey for over 17 years with some people who just checked in, once a month or once a week even, and you just got to see the way that they progress, their change of mind over sometimes years in the making. And that's what fires me. I just feel like God's given me this burden to have these kinds of conversations. I'm doing it in a slightly different way now, but since I moved on from the Unbelievable show. But yeah, I'm feeling that it's a space I actually want to move back into because I kind of miss it. It's there's
Mm.
something really real about having conversations rather than debates, and that's what I think God's asked me to do, and that's what I love doing.
Well, you and Gavin Ortland are my two go-to apologists that I think just engage people graciously and thoughtfully and just winsomely in the best sense and authentically. So I hope you get back to hosting those conversations. I know you'll get a quick audience. There's always a need for that. So any big or small way I can help, certainly let me know. Uh, got to let you go, but tell us maybe just those watching who are like, what, I've been wondering what Justin is doing and not been maybe tracking. Tell us your podcasting. Tell us a little bit about why I'm still a Christian, if you will.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm really enjoying, since moving on from hosting the Unbelievable show nearly 2 years ago, believe it or not. I've been loving kind of some new projects. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast is one of those where I kind of do a dive, a kind of narrative story of what's happened over the last 20 years and this new awareness and openness to God that I believe we're seeing in our culture. So that kind of tracks with the book that I wrote about that. Um, yeah, there are some plans afoot to begin a new dialogue show later in the year. So you heard it here first. Watch out for
Awesome.
that. More to be announced in due course.
Cool.
But that will be very exciting. That's kind of always been my first love, and I'm looking forward to getting in that seat again. But yeah, really excited about the new book as well. Why I'm Still a Christian. Um, it's a revised and updated edition first book that I wrote in some way. Really, it feels more relevant than ever to be putting it out there now because kind of like we saw, as we said, with that Wes Huff Joe Rogan moment, there's people who are kind of open now. It's like there's an open door. And I feel like this is the kind of book I hope a Christian would feel quite comfortable giving to their non-Christian friend who's suddenly just started asking the questions, and wondering about church. Because my hope is it's a kind of it's pitched at a level where it deals with some of the fundamental questions. It gives people an idea of the shape of Christianity, but it doesn't just leave it there. It doesn't just leave it at an intellectual level. It kind of challenges them by the end to step in, to try this on and see what happens. And yeah, and I'm excited to see more and more people doing that.
It's kind of a case for the Christian faith 101, but what makes it unique is, of course, the case for Christ. Strobel is a journalist investigating this. You have story after story of people you've talked with, Christian, atheist, agnostic, and you just fill the book with evidences, but it's really driven by the stories, which I think gives you unique insight, but also makes it more interesting than just a list of evidences, as is often the case. So it's a great book. I think people who are veterans in apologetics will get points out of it, the way you explain things and how you respond and the stories you tell. But certainly skeptics on the outside and new believers would have a sense of the case for Christianity. So Why I'm Still a Christian is excellent. Pick it up. Folks, before you click away, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other conversations and dialogues. I've reached out to a few very influential atheists. I don't know if they'll engage me in this kind of conversation or not, but hopefully that's coming. Regardless, we have conversations coming up on a host of apologetic and cultural related topics. If you thought about studying apologetics, we would love to have you at Biola, at Talbot School of Theology. Distance program. We have students in Australia, Africa, the UK, Singapore, New Zealand, across the United States. We'd love to have you. Information is below. Justin, great to catch up. Looking forward to our next conversation. Blessings on the launch of the new podcast Dialogue. I'll be looking for that and letting my folks know as soon as it's out.
Bless you. Thank you so much, Sean. Great to catch up with you.